3 weeks after the Battle of New Helena, the Galactic Council reconvened, and this time the atmosphere in the chamber was markedly different, and where before there had been arrogance and certainty, now there was caution and careful consideration. And Ambassador Claire Morrison entered the chamber flanked by Admiral Jackson, who wore his full-dress uniform decorated with medals from Earth's various conflicts, and the Council had specifically requested his presence, which was a tacit acknowledgement that this was now a military matter as well as a diplomatic one, and High Counselor Dreth called the session to order and announced that the Council had deliberated extensively on the human situation, and they had reviewed all the battle data and assessed their losses and considered their options carefully, and Claire remained standing with her posture relaxed but alert, and Kyle Bennett sat at the human delegation desk ready to provide any support that might be needed. And Dreth continued by saying that the Council acknowledged their initial assessment of humanity's capabilities had been flawed, and they had underestimated both human military strength and human resolve. And Admiral Jackson said dryly that this was certainly one way to put it. And a ripple of discomfort went through the assembled delegates because no one had ever addressed the Council with such casual disrespect before. But after what humanity had demonstrated in battle, no one dared to challenge him. And Shesh chimed in with his crystalline voice sounding more moderate than before, and said the question before them was how to proceed, and they had several options, and they could escalate by calling upon the full military resources of all member species, but intelligence suggested that would be extremely costly and potentially futile, given humanity's demonstrated production capacity, and Jackson confirmed that it would be very futile indeed, and said they had run the simulations, and even if the Council mobilized every single warship in Council space, they were looking at a protracted conflict they simply could not win. And he explained that human shipyards outproduced Council shipyards by a factor of 3, and human crews trained constantly in realistic combat scenarios. And the Council would win some battles, but they would ultimately lose the war. And Ambassador Zekthar, who had been silent until now, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully and said there was another option. And it was the one Ambassador Morrison had suggested 3 weeks ago, which was peace with humans as full Council members. And Claire asked if that was what the Council wanted and directed her question to everyone present, and said she needed to be very clear about humanity's terms and explained that humans wanted full membership with voting rights, equal to any other species. And they wanted recognition of all 17 colonies as legitimate human territories, and they wanted trade agreements, and technology sharing and cultural exchange, and they wanted to be partners and not subjects. And Dreth asked what humanity would offer in return, and Claire replied that in return, humans would contribute their strength to Council security, and human ships would help patrol trade routes and human technology would be shared freely, and human scientists would collaborate with alien researchers, and humanity would be constructive members of galactic civilization. And her expression hardened as she continued and said that the Council must understand that humanity would never again accept ultimatums and would never surrender their sovereignty and would defend their interests with the same ferocity they had shown at New Helena. And the Council chamber fell silent as all the delegates considered this, and finally Dreth spoke and said the Council would need to vote on full membership. But she believed she spoke for many when she said that humanity had earned its place among them, if not through wisdom, then certainly through strength. And Claire said with a slight smile that they would take that though she would argue it took considerable wisdom to prepare for this eventuality, and over the next several hours the details were hammered out carefully and treaties were drafted and boundaries were confirmed and the framework for human integration into Council society was established, and it was not perfect, and there were compromises on both sides, but it was workable. And as the session concluded, Zekthar approached Claire and Jackson and said that he owed them an apology because he had underestimated them very badly, and Claire replied that he had underestimated all of humanity, but she appreciated the acknowledgement and said that for what it was worth she hoped this could be the beginning of genuine cooperation, and Zekthar agreed, and said though he suspected his military career was over after this debacle, and Jackson clapped him on the shoulder, which was a gesture that clearly startled the Vryn commander, and said that Zekthar should look at it a different way, because he was now the general who had survived first contact with humanity, and that was going to make him very valuable as an advisor on human military doctrine, and he might have a whole new career ahead of him. And back on Earth, President Carter stood in the Oval Office looking out at the night sky, and the moon was visible, and he knew that beneath its surface the shipyards continued their work just in case. And Secretary Hayes entered carrying a tablet and announced that the council vote had just come through, and humanity had been granted full membership status, and all colonies were recognized, and trade agreements were pending ratification. And Carter nodded slowly and asked about the fleet, and Hayes replied that Admiral Jackson recommended they maintain their current production schedule for the next 5 years, and then scale back to sustainable levels, because he did not trust the council not to try something else once they had rebuilt their forces. And Carter said that Jackson was a smart man and told her to approve the recommendation and make sure their shipyard locations remained classified, and let the council wonder where human ships came from. And Hayes confirmed it was already done, and Carter turned from the window and said that when this started, he had been terrified. They had made the wrong choice, and that refusing to evacuate the colonies would lead to disaster. But now he realized that showing weakness would have been the real disaster, and Hayes observed that humanity had always responded poorly to bullying, and the council had learned that lesson the hard way. And on New Helena, life slowly returned to normal, and the debris in orbit had been cleared away, and the damaged ships had been repaired or replaced, and the scars on the planet's surface where council weapons had struck during the brief battle were being transformed into monuments to honor the fallen. And Governor Rick Chen stood at one such monument where the names of 300 colonists who had died in the battle were inscribed on black stone, and Maya Brooks stood beside him holding a wreath of local flowers, and Rick said quietly that 300 lives was the cost of freedom. And Maya replied that they had known the risks, and everyone on the colonies had known that refusing to evacuate might lead to war, and they had chosen to stay anyway. And Rick said it was because this was home and humans defend their homes, and above them, a squadron of human warships passed overhead on patrol, and their sleek forms cut through the atmosphere with a sonic boom that echoed like protective thunder. And in the years that followed, humanity's integration into the Galactic Council continued steadily, and human ships patrolled alongside council vessels, and human scientists collaborated with alien researchers, and human diplomats learned the intricate politics of galactic civilization. But the shipyards on Luna never stopped their production, and the fleets continued to grow, and the military trained constantly, running exercises that pushed crews and ships to their absolute limits, because the lesson of the Council's ultimatum had been learned and would never be forgotten. And in the vast darkness of space, the only true security was the ability to defend yourself, and the only real guarantee of peace was the strength to wage war if necessary. And when the Council looked at humanity now, they no longer saw a young species to be bullied and controlled, but instead they saw equals and partners, and if necessary, the most dangerous warriors in the entire galaxy. And the Council had anticipated humanity's surrender, but instead Earth's warships had filled the skies, and nothing would ever be the same again. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Vengeance and watched the stars shift back into focus as the massive warship dropped out of hyperspace. The jump had been smooth, but his stomach still felt tight with worry. 3 months had passed since anyone heard from the colony ships that had ventured into this region of space. 3 months of silence from over 5,000 human souls who had left Earth seeking new homes among the stars. Lieutenant Nina Hayes sat at her communications console with her fingers moving rapidly across the holographic controls. Her face had gone pale in the dim blue light of the bridge displays. She pressed her headset closer to her ear, and her eyes widened as fragmented transmissions began filtering through the static. The messages were old, recorded weeks ago, but they painted a terrifying picture. Voices screamed about gods and eternal beings and judgment from above. Colonists begged for mercy from entities they called divine masters. Some transmissions cut off mid-sentence, leaving only the empty hiss of dead channels. Captain Helen Foster moved to stand beside Morrison at the forward viewport. She was a veteran of the Mars Rebellion and the Outer Colony Wars. A woman who had seen humanity at its worst and best. Her gray eyes scanned the tactical displays that surrounded them, taking in every detail of the system they had just entered. The fourth planet from the local star showed signs of human settlement, but something was wrong. Energy readings spiked in patterns that made no sense. Huge structures orbited the world that matched nothing in their databases. Nina finally spoke, and her voice trembled slightly. The distress signals all said the same thing in different ways. The colonies had been intercepted by ships that appeared out of nowhere, Beings of light and power had descended upon the helpless colonists and declared themselves to be gods. They demanded worship and obedience. Those who questioned were made examples of in terrible ways. The last clear transmission had been a plea for Earth to send help, but to come prepared for something beyond normal warfare. Morrison felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. The Vengeance was the most advanced warship humanity had ever built, equipped with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand a sun's fury. Its crew of 800 were the best Earth had to offer, trained for every conceivable threat. But gods? That was something from ancient stories, not the cold reality of space exploration. Captain Foster ordered the ship to move closer to the fourth planet at reduced speed. She wanted sensors running full scans on everything in the system. If there were hostile forces present, she needed to know their capabilities before committing to action. The bridge crew worked in focused silence, each person understanding that lives depended on their vigilance. The science officer, Lieutenant Peter Grant, hunched over his station with displays reflected in his glasses. He was young but brilliant, the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. His instruments detected massive energy signatures near the planet, sources of power that dwarfed anything human technology could produce. But there was something else. Subtle readings that suggested these energy sources were not entirely alien to physics, as humanity understood it. They were advanced, certainly, but not magical. That was when it appeared. The view screen flickered and suddenly filled with an image that made several crew members gasp. A being of pure radiance stood before them, tall and impossibly beautiful with features that seemed to shift between human and something entirely other. Light poured from its form in waves that hurt to look at directly. When it spoke, the voice resonated through the ship's hull itself, vibrating in their bones and teeth. The being called itself Zarathon, the Eternal Judge. It spoke with absolute authority, declaring that humanity had trespassed into sacred space that belonged to the Ascended Ones. These beings, Zarathon explained, were immortal rulers who had transcended the limitations of flesh thousands of years before humans had even discovered fire. They had witnessed civilizations rise and fall across the galaxy. They had judged countless species and found most wanting. Now humanity would bow before their divine authority, or be erased from existence like so many others before them. Morrison crossed his arms and studied the being on the screen. Something about Zarathon's grand speech felt rehearsed, like a performance meant to intimidate rather than inform. The commander had dealt with warlords and dictators before, beings who used fear as their primary weapon. This felt similar despite all the talk of divinity and eternal power. Zarathon continued with his demands. All human vessels would surrender immediately. The colonists would acknowledge the Ascended Ones as their supreme masters and gods. They would serve without question for as long as the gods deemed necessary. Resistance would result in total annihilation. There would be no negotiation, no mercy for those who defied the will of immortal beings. Captain Foster kept her voice steady as she responded. She requested proof of Zarathon's divinity and his right to rule over humans who had never heard of the Ascended Ones. She asked for a diplomatic meeting to discuss terms that both sides could accept. Her words were calm and reasonable, buying time for her crew to gather more information. The response was immediate and horrifying. The view screen split to show one of the human colony ships, the vessel called Morning Star that carried over 1,000 settlers. Zarathon's face remained on one half of the display, cold and unmoved. The other half showed the Morning Star beginning to glow with unnatural light. The ship's hull started to disintegrate, simply coming apart at the molecular level. Escape pods launched in desperation, but they too dissolved into nothing. In less than 30 seconds, 1,000 human beings ceased to exist, their atoms scattered across the void. Nina broke down at her console. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to maintain her composure. These were not just numbers on a casualty report. They were families she had spoken with during the journey preparations. Children she had helped pack toys for the long voyage, friends who had been excited about building new lives on a distant world. Morrison's hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles went white. Captain Foster's expression transformed from diplomatic neutrality to something cold and dangerous. Around the bridge, the crew members who had been uncertain before now showed only grim determination. Whatever these beings were, gods or something else, they had just made a fatal error. They had shown humanity exactly what they were dealing with and what was at stake. Zarathon spoke again with his voice dripping false sympathy. The Morning Star's destruction was regrettable, but necessary to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The remaining human ships had 24 hours to surrender completely. After that time, the Ascended Ones would begin systematic extermination of every human in the system. The choice was simple: bow and live as slaves or stand and die as fools. The transmission ended and the view screen returned to showing the star field outside. But now that view included a spreading cloud of debris where the Morning Star had been. Captain Foster stood in silence for a long moment, then turned to face her bridge crew. Her orders were clear and direct. The Vengeance would pull back to a safer distance to analyze the situation. They would scan everything they could about these so-called gods and their technology, and they would find a way to make Zarathon and his kind pay for what they had done. Because if there was one thing humanity had learned through centuries of conflict, it was this: anything that could kill could also be killed. The Vengeance drifted through the asteroid belt at the edge of the system, its engines running at minimal power to avoid detection. Captain Foster had ordered what appeared to be a retreat, sending messages to Zarathon that humanity needed time to consider his demands. In reality, the warship had become a hive of intense activity, as every scientist, engineer, and tactical officer worked to unravel the mystery of the Ascended Ones. Lieutenant Grant had not slept in 2 days. His station was covered with displays showing energy readings, wave patterns, and structural analyses of the beings who called themselves gods. He drank his 5th cup of coffee and squinted at the data that refused to make sense at first glance. But slowly patterns began to emerge from the chaos. The power signatures that seemed so alien actually followed rules. Mathematical progressions that suggested technology rather than magic. Dr. Linda Carter joined him at the science station, bringing fresh eyes to the problem. She was the ship's chief medical officer, but her specialty in xenobiology made her uniquely qualified to analyze any biological aspects of their enemy. Together, they started comparing notes, cross-referencing Grant's energy readings with Carter's biological scans. What they found made both of them sit up straighter with excitement. The Ascended Ones were not beings of pure energy as they appeared. Beneath the radiant glow, sensors detected solid matter with mass and temperature. They consumed energy from their surroundings in ways that suggested biological processes. They were alive in the most fundamental sense, which meant they could potentially die. Morrison assembled his tactical team in the briefing room. Lieutenant Alex Turner, the ship's best combat strategist, spread holographic projections across the table, showing every recorded interaction with the Ascended Ones. Sergeant Chris Bailey, who led the Marine detachment, pointed out defensive patterns in how their vessels moved. Even gods, it seemed, had habits and preferences that could be exploited. Meanwhile, the Ascended Ones grew more confident in their dominance. More of them appeared throughout the system, each announcing grandiose titles: Meridon the Timeless, Celestia the Infinite, Vorthan the Undying. They surrounded the remaining human colony ships and herded them toward the main settlement planet like farmers gathering livestock. Their massive vessels gleamed in the starlight, ornate and beautiful in ways that human ships could never match. The beings began performing what they called divine demonstrations. Meridon moved an asteroid twice the size of Earth's moon, relocating it to a new orbit with apparent ease. Celestia generated storms of energy that lit up the void between planets, displays of power that seemed to defy physics itself. Vorthan caused a barren moon to crack and split, its core exposed and glowing. Each miracle was accompanied by sermons about the eternal nature of the Ascended Ones and how humanity should feel, honored to serve such magnificent masters. But Lieutenant Grant noticed something crucial during each demonstration. Energy spikes occurred in specific nodes on the ascended vessels, just before each display of power. The patterns were consistent and predictable. Whatever was creating these miracles required preparation and specific technological support. God should not need machinery to work wonders. Dr. Carter made an equally important discovery while analyzing the biological data. The Ascended Ones showed cellular structures that suggested extreme age, thousands of years certainly, but the cells were maintained by something artificial, microscopic machines that repaired damage and prevented natural decay. It was advanced nanotechnology, far beyond what humanity currently possessed, but it was still technology. It could potentially be disrupted. Morrison brought all this information to Captain Foster in her ready room. The two of them reviewed the data carefully, checking every conclusion twice before committing to any course of action. The hypothesis was becoming clear. The Ascended Ones were an ancient species that had achieved remarkable technological advancement. They used this advantage to conquer younger civilizations by presenting themselves as gods. Their immortality was not divine but technological, maintained by systems that might have weaknesses. Foster made a decision that would put her entire crew at risk. They would not surrender, but they also would not attack blindly. First, they needed definitive proof that these gods could be hurt. They needed to strip away the mystique and show the other species in the region that rebellion was possible. The captain authorized a covert reconnaissance mission that could easily end in disaster. Lieutenant Turner led the operation personally. He took the Vengeance's most advanced stealth shuttle, a craft designed to slip past enemy sensors using a combination of heat dampening and signal absorption. His team consisted of 3 specialists, a sensor operator, a drone technician, and a combat medic in case things went wrong. Their mission was to approach one of the Ascended vessels close enough to deploy, scanning drones and gather detailed information about the technology that made these beings seem divine. The shuttle slipped through the asteroid field using the tumbling rocks as cover. Turner piloted with steady hands, making micro-adjustments to avoid detection. His target was the vessel belonging to Meridon the Timeless, a cathedral-like structure that hung in space radiating soft golden light. The ship was beautiful in an otherworldly way, all spires and flowing curves that seemed more grown than built. As they approached, the sensor operator worked frantically to map the Ascended vessel's defensive grid. There were gaps, tiny windows where the exotic shielding did not quite overlap. Turner threaded the shuttle through one of these gaps, moving at a crawl to avoid creating detectable gravitational distortions. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air in the cabin. The drone technician deployed 6 scanning devices, each no larger than a human thumb. The drones attached themselves to Meridon's hull using magnetic clamps and began transmitting data back to the Vengeance in tight beam bursts that would be almost impossible to intercept. Within minutes, information flooded back to the waiting science teams. Dr. Carter watched her displays fill with medical data, and her eyes widened in amazement. The Ascended Ones were indeed biological beings, who had integrated advanced nanotechnology into every cell of their bodies. The microscopic machines repaired damage, enhanced physical abilities, and even generated the luminous auras that made the beings appear divine. But there was a central control system, a hub located in what would be equivalent to a human brainstem. This hub coordinated all the nanomachines throughout the body. Lieutenant Grant discovered something equally important in the technological scans. The exotic energy that powered the Ascended vessels and the nanotechnology in their bodies all operated on a specific frequency band. It was narrow and precise, probably chosen because it avoided interference from natural stellar phenomena. But that specificity also created a vulnerability. A properly tuned electromagnetic pulse could potentially disrupt the entire system. What shocked everyone most was what the drones found in the lower decks of Meridon's vessel. There were hundreds of beings held in stasis chambers, members of other species that had been subjugated by the Ascended Ones. Some appeared to be servants kept in suspended animation until needed. Others looked like prisoners or perhaps specimens being preserved for unknown purposes. The implications were staggering. How many other species had fallen to these false gods? Turner extracted his team without incident, and the shuttle returned to the Vengeance. The reconnaissance had been a complete success. They now had detailed scans of Ascended technology and biology. More importantly, they had identified potential weaknesses that could be exploited. Captain Foster called a secure meeting with the commanders of the other human vessels still surviving in the system. Using encrypted channels that the Ascended Ones had not yet detected, she shared everything they had learned. Captain Danny Rogers of the colony ship New Horizon was the first to respond, and his voice carried barely controlled rage. These beings who demanded worship were nothing but tyrants with good technology and better lies. Morrison presented his plan to the assembled commanders. The Ascended Ones' greatest weapon was not their technology, but the fear they inspired and the belief in their invincibility. If humanity could damage or kill one of these gods in front of witnesses, it would shatter that psychological advantage. Other subjugated species might find courage to resist. The empire of false divinity would begin to crack. The plan was dangerous and would require perfect timing. The Vengeance would challenge Zarathon directly, goading him into single combat. Meanwhile, the other ships would position themselves to record everything and be ready to evacuate if the situation collapsed. Lieutenant Kyle Martin, the weapons officer, began working with Chief Engineer Rachel Moore to modify one of their torpedo systems. They needed to create a weapon that could deliver an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to shut down Ascended nanotechnology without destroying the Vengeance's own systems. As the human ships prepared for battle, the Ascended ones continued their demonstrations of power, completely unaware that their secrets had been discovered. Zarathon preached to the terrified colonists about the futility of resistance and the glory of serving eternal masters. His words rang hollow to those who now knew the truth, but the time for revelation had not yet come. First, humanity. The modified torpedo sat in its launch tube, the culmination of 72 hours of non-stop work by the Vengeance's engineering team. Chief Engineer Rachel Moore had personally supervised every modification, checking and rechecking the electromagnetic pulse generator that had been built into the weapon's core. One mistake in the frequency calibration and the torpedo would be useless, or worse, it might damage the Vengeance itself. But Moore was confident in her work, and she gave Captain Foster a thumbs up from the engineering. Bay Lieutenant Martin ran final diagnostics on the weapon systems while his hands moved across the controls with practiced precision. The tactical display showed firing solutions, impact predictions, and backup plans if the primary attack failed. Everything had to be perfect because they would only get one shot at this. If the torpedo missed or failed to disable Zarathon's technology, the Ascended one would almost certainly destroy the Vengeance before they could reload. Captain Foster sat in her command chair and reviewed the battle plan one final time. Her gray eyes scanned every detail, looking for flaws or overlooked variables. Satisfied that they had done everything possible to prepare, she nodded to Lieutenant Hayes at Communications. It was time to throw down the challenge that would either free this system or doom them all. Hayes opened a channel directly to Zarathon, broadcasting on frequencies that every ship in the system could monitor. Her voice was steady as she transmitted Captain Foster's message. The captain accused the Eternal Judge of cowardice, of hiding behind light shows and murdering defenseless people. She called him a fraud who feared to face humans in honest combat. She demanded that if Zarathon was truly a god worthy of worship, he should prove it by facing the Vengeance in direct battle. The response was immediate and furious. Every view screen on every human vessel suddenly filled with Zarathon's image. The being's luminous form blazed brighter than before, crackling with barely contained rage. His voice thundered through the void, causing hull plates to vibrate with its intensity. No mortal had dared speak to the Ascended ones with such disrespect in over 3,000 years. Zarathon declared that he would personally obliterate the Vengeance and every soul aboard. Then he would make the remaining humans watch as he destroyed their colonies one person at a time. Morrison walked through the ship during the final minutes before engagement. He stopped at stations throughout the Vengeance, offering words of encouragement to crew members who looked frightened or tense. In the medical bay, he found Nina Hayes helping Dr. Carter prepare for potential casualties. The young communications officer had volunteered to assist with triage, needing to do something useful with her hands while she waited for the battle to begin. Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder and reminded her why they fought, so that no other human would die on their knees before false gods. On the colony ships, families huddled together in common areas and observation decks. Parents held their children close, some praying to gods they actually believed in, others simply hoping that the brave crew of the Vengeance knew what they were doing. Captain Rogers addressed his people over the New Horizons internal communications, telling them to have faith in their fellow humans and to remember that freedom was always worth fighting for. Zarathon's massive vessel moved into position, its ornate hull gleaming as it approached the Vengeance. The Ascended ship was 3 times larger than the human warship, bristling with weapons that humanity had no names for. Energy crackled along its spires, and the space around it seemed to bend and shimmer with barely contained power. It was a display meant to terrify, to make any opponent lose hope before the first shot was even fired. But Captain Foster had positioned the Vengeance exactly where she wanted it. In a region of space where natural radiation from a nearby nebula would interfere with some of Zarathon's more exotic sensors. It was a small advantage, but they needed every edge they could get. She gave Morrison a slight nod, and he returned it with a confident smile. They were ready. The engagement began with Zarathon demonstrating his divine wrath. Beams of pure energy lanced out from his vessel, weapons that operated on principles human science barely understood. The attacks hit the Vengeance's shields with tremendous force, causing the entire ship to shudder. Alert klaxons wailed and damage reports started flooding in from multiple sections. But the shields held, designed by human engineers who had learned hard lessons from decades of warfare. Foster ordered evasive maneuvers, and the Vengeance began to move, not fleeing, but repositioning. Lieutenant Turner had calculated the optimal firing solution, and they needed Zarathon's ship in exactly the right place. The ascended vessel pursued, confident in its overwhelming superiority. Zarathon's voice boomed across all channels, mocking the humans for their futile resistance. The Vengeance's conventional weapons fired back, railgun slugs and particle beams that struck Zarathon's shields and dissipated harmlessly. It looked like a desperate and ineffective defense, exactly what Foster wanted the Ascended One to see. Let him think they were helpless, let him grow more confident and careless. Lieutenant Martin watched his tactical display with absolute focus. Zarathon's vessel had to lower a portion of its exotic shielding to fire its most powerful weapons, a vulnerability that lasted less than 2 seconds. But 2 seconds was enough if you were ready and knew exactly when to strike. The weapons officer's finger hovered over the firing control, waiting for the perfect moment. The ascended ship's main weapons began to charge, energy building in crystalline arrays that ran along its hull. Zarathon intended to end this fight with one overwhelming strike that would vaporize the Vengeance completely. The shields dropped in the predictable pattern that Grant's analysis had predicted. Foster's command rang out sharp and clear across the bridge. Martin's finger came down on the control, and the modified torpedo launched from its tube. The weapon streaked across the void, its trajectory deliberately erratic to avoid point defense systems. Turner had programmed the flight path personally, using every trick he had learned in years of combat training. Zarathon's vessel tried to intercept the torpedo, but the unpredictable course made targeting difficult. The weapon weaved through defensive fire, taking minor damage that did not compromise its primary function. It detonated just 30 meters from the ascended ship's hull, and the electromagnetic pulse exploded outward in an invisible wave of disruption. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then the luminous glow that surrounded Zarathon's vessel flickered like a candle in wind. The exotic shields that had seemed impenetrable stuttered and failed. The weapons that had been charging suddenly went dark. And most importantly, the being who called himself the Eternal Judge became visible in his true form. Every view screen in the system showed the transformation. The radiant figure of divine light faded away, revealing the creature beneath. Zarathon stood approximately 8 feet tall with pale blue skin that seemed almost translucent. He had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face, and his limbs were longer and more angular than human proportions. He was still imposing and clearly alien, but he was undeniably physical and biological. The god had become flesh, and flesh could be wounded. Morrison did not hesitate. His voice carried absolute authority as he gave the order to all weapon stations. The Vengeance unleashed everything it had in a concentrated barrage. Railgun slugs moving at significant fractions of light speed hammered into the ascended vessel's now vulnerable hull. Particle beams carved through armor that had lost its exotic protections. Missiles that had been held in reserve streaked toward critical systems that sensors had identified during the reconnaissance mission. Inside Zarathon's vessel, alarms screamed in frequencies that would have been painful to human ears. The being who had not felt physical pain in over 2,000 years suddenly experienced his ship dying around him. Hull breaches appeared, atmosphere vented into space, and systems failed throughout the massive structure. He tried to restore his nanotechnology, to bring back the enhancements that made him seem divine, but the electromagnetic pulse had disrupted the delicate frequency that coordinated everything. The other Ascended Ones watched from their distant positions with something they had not experienced in millennia: fear. Meridon, Celestia, and Vorthan saw their companions struggling against mere humans, saw the impossible happening before their eyes. Their entire existence was built on the belief that they were beyond challenge, that their power made them invincible. That belief cracked as they watched Zarathon's vessel break apart under sustained human weapons fire. On the human colony ships and among the vessels of other subjugated species, beings who had been forced to watch Zarathon's displays of power now witnessed something entirely different. They saw a god reduced to his true form, saw his technology fail, saw him become vulnerable. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Whispers spread through crowded decks and holding cells. If one ascended one could be hurt, then perhaps they all could be. Zarathon made one final attempt to save himself. He appeared on the communications channels, his image no longer glowing or transcendent. His alien face showed raw desperation as he tried to plead for mercy, to negotiate some kind of truce. But Captain Foster's expression remained cold and unmoved. The silence after the final explosion felt different from the one that had followed Zarathon's death. This time it was not shock, but exhaustion, mixed with disbelief that so much had changed so quickly. Across the system, ships that had been firing, moments before now drifted in uncertain formations as crews tried to comprehend their new reality. The Ascended Ones were gone, and the empire they had built over thousands of years had collapsed in a single day. Captain Foster stood on the bridge of the Vengeance and surveyed the damage reports scrolling across her displays. The warship had taken significant punishment during the battle, and would need weeks of repairs before it could safely attempt the journey back to Earth. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had won something far greater than a military victory. They had broken chains that had bound entire civilizations for longer than human recorded history. The communications channels were chaos as dozens of species tried to establish contact with each other and with the humans who had sparked this revolution. Lieutenant Hayes worked tirelessly to organize the flood of incoming messages, prioritizing distress calls from damaged vessels and attempting to establish some kind of coordinated response to the crisis. Because liberation brought its own problems, especially for species that had known nothing but servitude for generations, Krell became an unexpected bridge between the humans and the other freed species. He spoke multiple languages and had knowledge of the region's politics from before his imprisonment. Dr. Carter worked closely with him to identify which species needed immediate medical attention and which vessels were in danger of life support failure. The Vengeance's crew found themselves conducting rescue operations, saving beings who had been their enemies just hours before. Commander Morrison led teams to board several of the damaged ascended vessels, searching for more prisoners in stasis, and securing the dangerous technology before it could fall into the wrong hands. What they found in the lower decks of these ships was heartbreaking. Thousands of beings from dozens of species had been kept in suspended animation, some for centuries. Many were scientists or leaders who had resisted the Ascended Ones and been preserved as trophies or potential hostages. Lieutenant Grant and Chief Engineer Moore worked together to analyze the captured nanotechnology that had given the Antheri their godlike powers. The systems were incredibly advanced, built on principles that would take human science decades to fully understand. Grant made a recommendation that surprised many. They should destroy most of it. The temptation to use such power would corrupt anyone who possessed it, and the galaxy did not need new gods to replace the old ones. This suggestion sparked heated debate among the freed species. Some wanted to study the technology to defend against anyone who might try to use similar methods in the future. Others agreed with Grant that it was too dangerous to keep. Representatives from different species gathered aboard the Vengeance for an impromptu council. The first time many of them had met as equals rather than as master and servant. Captain Foster found herself serving as a mediator in discussions she had never been trained for. She listened as beings who had been enemies for generations tried to find common ground. A compromise slowly emerged through hours of difficult negotiation. The most dangerous aspects of the technology would be destroyed, but detailed records would be kept in a secure archive maintained by a joint council of species. Knowledge would be preserved, but the actual weapons and enhancement systems would be eliminated. The human colonists who had been trapped on the planet's surface were finally rescued and brought back to their ships. They told stories of living under constant surveillance by the Ascended Ones, of watching others disappear for questioning or punishment. Children had grown up knowing only fear and forced worship. The psychological damage would take years to heal, but at least now they had hope for a future built on truth rather than lies. Captain Danny Rogers and the survivors aboard the New Horizon made a decision that would shape the region's future. They chose to stay in the system and build their colony as originally planned, but now it would be different. They would establish their settlement as a free port, a place where all species could trade and interact as equals. The fourth planet would become a symbol of cooperation rather than oppression. Lieutenant Turner was promoted to commander in a ceremony that took place on the scarred bridge of the Vengeance. Morrison recognized his tactical brilliance and leadership during the crucial reconnaissance mission that had made victory possible. Turner's first assignment was to help organize a coalition fleet that would hunt down any remaining Antheri who had escaped the battle and might try to rebuild their empire elsewhere. The biggest challenge was dealing with the aftermath of 4,000 years of authoritarian rule. Many species had no living memory of self-governance. They had social structures built entirely around serving the Ascended Ones and needed help reimagining what their civilizations could become. Krell and other elders who remembered life before subjugation worked with younger leaders to begin the slow process of rebuilding their cultures. Dr. Carter and Lieutenant Grant established a research station on one of the system's moons, dedicated to studying ancient technologies and finding ways to protect developing civilizations from similar threats. Their work would focus on detection and defense, creating early warning systems that could identify when a species was using advanced technology to dominate others. It was ambitious but necessary if the galaxy was to avoid repeating this dark chapter of history. The Vengeance remained in the system for 3 months, while repairs were completed, and the initial chaos of liberation began to settle into something resembling order. During this time, Morrison walked through the ship and spoke with crew members about their experiences. Many struggled with what they had seen and done, even though their actions had been necessary. Nina Hayes in particular needed time to process the trauma of watching the Morningstar die, and then participating in the battle that avenged those deaths. A memorial was constructed on the planet's surface, built from fragments of both human and alien vessels that had fought in the liberation battle. At its center was a piece of Zarathon's flagship, a reminder that beings who claimed divine authority were still subject to mortality. The inscription was written in every language spoken by the freed species, a simple statement that carried profound meaning. Gods who bleed are not gods at all. Captain Foster gave a speech at the memorial's dedication that was broadcast across the system and eventually made its way back to Earth. She spoke about courage and the importance of questioning authority, especially when that authority demanded worship rather than earning respect. She praised the subjugated species who had found the strength to turn on their oppressors at the critical moment, noting that the humans had only provided a spark while others had fueled the fire of revolution. As the Vengeance prepared to depart on its new mission to hunt remaining Antheri, the crew reflected on how much had changed. They had left Earth as explorers and protectors of human colonists. Now they were part of something larger, a coalition of species working together to ensure that tyranny disguised as divinity would never again take root in their region of space. Morrison stood on the bridge beside Captain Foster as the ship's engines powered up for departure. Through the forward viewport, he could see the coalition fleet assembling, ships from a dozen species moving in formation. It was messy and imperfect, with vessels of wildly different designs trying to coordinate their movements, but it was also beautiful in its own way, a visible representation of diversity and freedom. The galaxy was a dangerous place full of challenges that would test them all, but it was also a place where courage and ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Ascended Ones had ruled for millennia, believing their power made them untouchable and their longevity made them wise. They had forgotten the most important truth, that power without accountability becomes tyranny, and tyranny can always be opposed by those brave enough to stand. The Vengeance jumped to hyperspace carrying its crew toward new missions and unknown dangers. Behind them, the freed species began writing new chapters of their histories, no longer as subjects, but as independent peoples. The colony on the fourth planet grew into a thriving hub of trade and culture where humans and aliens worked side by side. Years later, the story of what happened in that system would be told and retold across hundreds of worlds. It became a legend that inspired other rebellions against oppressive regimes and served as a warning to anyone who thought advanced technology or long life gave them the right to rule others. The tale of the Vengeance and its crew became part of galactic history a reminder that freedom is not granted by gods or tyrants, but claimed by those willing to fight for it. Jake Morrison eventually retired from active service and became an instructor at Earth's Naval Academy, teaching new generations about the importance of questioning assumed truths and standing against injustice regardless of the odds. Helen Foster was promoted to admiral and played a key role in establishing humanity's relationships with the dozens of species that had been freed from Antheri control. The hunt for remaining Antheri took decades, but the coalition was patient and thorough. Each time the